I'd like to begin today with a reading from Whispers from Eternity. O Krishna, Lord of Hindustan, I sorrowed by the lonely Jumna river where thy flute notes thrilled the air and led lost calves to their divine home. O lotus of love, musing on the sad absence of thy delusion-dispelling eyes, I saw thine invisible spirit take form, frozen by my devotion's frost. Thy divine body of sky-blue light walked with feet of eternity on the banks of my mind, planting there the lasting footprints of divine realization. I am one of those lost calves which followed thy flower footprints on the shoals of time. I listen to the melody of thy flute of wisdom. I now follow the middle path of calm activity by which thou hast led many through the portals of their dark past into the eternal light. Since all souls belong to thy fold, whether we move forward or are sidetracked or are hemmed in, unmoving in the fogs of disbelief, O divine Krishna, lead us back to thy unfolding shed of everlasting freedom. O Krishna, thou reignest supreme on the heart throne of all those who now love thee. It's interesting there in that reading, Master uses the word, he speaks of Krishna, but in that one phrase, he writes it Krishna, Christ, Jesus Christ, na. And meaning, in a sense, indicating that the divine spirit of omnipresence that informs all avatars was also informing the life of Sri Krishna. And although he lived perhaps thousands of years ago, he's alive today in the hearts of people in our devotion. And we recall that to us when we imagine the light, or we see the light and we call to that light. Our devotion's call draws those souls, the great ones, into our lives very tangibly. And this is true for all of the great ones. And that message that Krishna brought many thousands of years ago is the same message that the avatars, the great ones, have brought ever since. And so today we honor that. And it's traditional, of course, in when you celebrate anyone's birthday or a day of the year especially dedicated to a certain one of the saints, you tell stories, but the stories that have been passed down, it's hard to know what actually the stories are because they're lost in time. But nevertheless, there's hundreds and thousands of stories, and I see them all stories of trying to capture the infinite through the symbolism of the stories, because all of them have some symbolic meaning. But for me, Janmashtami is a celebration through Lord Krishna as a pure expression of avatar. When I think of the word avatar, and I first came to understand that whole concept of what that meant, it was in my mind, it was Sri Krishna. Perhaps, if I remember right, it was through the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna says that he has come many times, and he had, as an avatar comes, as he says, descends to dispel darkness and to awaken virtue. And when virtue declines and darkness is in the ascendant, I come again and again and to reestablish Dharma in this world. And the implication, of course, as I've come to learn afterwards, is that Krishna says that yes, he had come many times. He names in the past, and the implication there is that he would come again. And the avatars come again and again, and we think of it as, and people do, just as in Christianity, people think of Jesus Christ as God, people think of Krishna as God, Rama is God. I think it's more correct to say that God has come as Krishna. God has come as Rama. God has come as Jesus Christ, and God has come as the great masters. And in our tradition of self-realization, we are taught that, as Master said, that Babaji has come as an incarnation, a reappearance of that divine avatar spirit of Krishna in our era, that even today, that incorruptible body of Babaji can be found somewhere perhaps in the Himalayas, guiding not just us, those who are Kriya Yogis, but guiding the spiritual unfoldment of humanity in this age, just as Krishna has been guiding that in the past and will continue in the ages to come in one form or another. That spirit of the avatar, the spirit of God that appears in these divine forms, will again and again and again be there. And to me, thinking of it as terms of Janmashtami as a celebration of the avatar, it's something that has given me hope. It's given me a sense of inspiration, because I realize in that concept of the avatar that there is a guiding hand in this world, that by implication of that there is purpose, there's some direction, that we as souls are connected on some intangible, to us at least, means we're connected to a divine purpose in life, which is the goal of all souls, to ultimately unite ourselves with God in divine union once again. And that it's not it seems chaotic, but it's not. Well, maybe it is chaotic, but it certainly is not random. And it's not accidental. We're here for a purpose. And the avatar comes and appears as an expression of pure grace to help each soul ultimately to fulfill its own divine destiny. And an avatar comes, not appears, as Krishna did. There's no compulsion. He's not compelled. An avatar is not compelled to come. But although there's no compulsion, and it's it's not accidental. It comes with a purpose. And again, to reestablish and to reaffirm Dharma in this world, that there is a divine direction, that it's built into, not just in humanity, but it's built into the very universe itself. The universe itself has an underlying direction to it. It has an underlying purpose to it. It's not just a random event. It's something that there's a direction. You can see it in the very universe itself, of expansion, of inclusion, and ultimately behind it, there's spirit ultimately trying to reunite all these little individual sparks of that divine flame into that flame itself. Now, I see, this, you might say, is an active manifestation or an active expression, as all avatars are, an active incarnation of grace. Grace is that power to uplift one spiritually, the power to uplift not just an individual here. In this case, the avatar comes for individuals, but particularly through the Guru, but also for humanity as a whole, the world as a whole. And I think of a story, and it reminds me, or you could say, this story reminds me that the avatar comes to tilt the scales, the balance wheel, or the balance scales, to tip it into mankind's favor. You might into the ascendant. And in other words, to give that sense of underlying cosmic direction toward upliftment, toward light, toward freedom of the soul. And there's a story, that you might say a theme that surrounds the story of the Mahabharata and the battle that takes place there, upon which the Bhagavad Gita, word Bhagavad Gita, is set. And if we know the story, and I think most of us have read the story, this battle takes place And in little ways, these armies, in many ways, are balanced. It's not obvious which side is going to win, because on the one hand, you have a very army of the Kauravas, which is much larger than that of the Pandavas, but the Pandavas have great warriors, and of course the Pandavas have Krishna on their side, but it's not determined who is going to win. And Krishna, you could say, tilts the scales in very subtle ways, and I think you'll have to read the story, but I don't want to go into the details here. But he tilts the scales, and in a sense, the Duryodhana, toward the end of the story, when he's dying, he accuses Krishna of being unfair. He didn't uphold Dharma, the balance of outward fairness in the battle. And the Pandavas too are a bit shaken, because they know that there's some truth to what Duryodhana is saying there. And it's quite a mystery, and people have explained this story, the symbolism of that story in many ways. But one part of it is, after Duryodhana has spoken, and after the Pandavas seem to be in a little bit of despair of, yes, why, Krishna, did you intercede in these ways that seem outwardly to be somewhat unfair? And Krishna rebukes the Pandavas, and he tells them very sternly, he says, you could never defeat the Kauravas on your own. In a fair fight between the qualities of good and the qualities of evil that are embodied in that story, which are embedded within each one of us, ultimately, the Kauravas on that level, on the material level, in the created world, the world is tilted toward the darkness, because that's what keeps this world of creation, of duality, in motion. It has to be that way, or else the world would dissolve immediately back into the light. There has to be this propelling force outward into creation, and when we solve our problems in life purely on the rational, dualistic mind, that level of the intellect, when we try to engage in making the perfect world so everything is just right, somehow there's this crumbling that the best of intentions seem to somehow ultimately fail, that there is a power that ultimately tilts the scales toward duality, that tilts the scales on the creative level of this creation, that power of darkness that is there, and left the devotee, left to their own devices, trying to conquer evil through, or to conquer duality using the means of duality, is doomed to fail. And so Krishna reminds him, he says, without my presence, without my help, you could never win on your own. And this is something for us to keep in mind. We have to do our best in life. We have to approach worldly problems on a certain level. We have to be practical in our idealism, as Master said. But we cannot discount the influence of grace. We cannot, just to confront evil, to confront darkness on its own terms is going to ultimately fail for us. We have to bring in a higher power into whatever we do. And this applies on the spiritual level, and it applies on the very material level. It's the power of grace. There is an act of grace that is even beyond our individual efforts, but we, on our part, can open the door to allow that grace, and we can summon that grace. That's the purpose of divine prayer. That's the purpose of reaching out to God and gurus to come into our lives to help us, because it's not a fair fight. You could say, and if you were to use the Western term, Satan is you might say, powerful in that domain. There's a story Master would tell about the man who wanted to get rid of a demon. And he went to a priest, and the demon gave him did various mantras infusing this potion, this powder, with blessings. He says, now when the demon comes, just simply throw this powder on the demon and it will disappear. And so the demon eventually appeared to this man. The man took his powder and threw it on the demon, and the demon just laughed. He says, ha! Before you even threw that powder on me, I got into the powder itself. And ultimately, you could say this is when we work on the level of duality, which means when we work strictly through our own ego, that it's already certainly corrupted by that duality. So we have to invoke that divine presence. So you could say Krishna is saying, could man find freedom if God did not reach down? Can we find freedom if grace didn't exist? Yet, no, we could not. But grace is there to all those who are willing to reach up and invoke that grace. And so we, on Janmashtami and any of these celebrations of the great masters, we think of the various stories and we give form. And many people criticize that and say, oh, that couldn't possibly be true. But behind that form, behind those stories, there's symbolic value. And even if we don't approach the great ones on that level, yes, maybe you could say there's a certain limitation, but the mere act of invoking the presence of the great ones in whatever way, whether, as it says in the Gita, whatever we offer the very highest of our aspirations, or we just offer something very simple. If in the act of our daily lives we live in that way, act, giving, offering, even the simplest of actions up to God, we open the door by that to allow God, in whatever form that might be, to come into us. And so it's not for us to criticize anybody in terms of their other person's devotions. I grew up of course, in a Christian culture, America, and I had for many years a somewhat of a bias, you might say, against it, because it was often very dogmatic in the people that I knew that were Christians, and basically those who didn't believe as they believed, they were somewhat dismissed. And so consequently, that never seemed right to me. And it's the same, but then I began to look around. I said, all cultures are like that. People approach God on the level of their own understanding. And that is not for us to criticize. It's for us to recognize and honor in their own way and encourage everybody. And so I think when we tell stories, however we approach God, it's like that phrase, is in whatever form that we approach God, that's honorable. If it's approached with a loving attitude in the heart, and we should encourage that. Just as the child plays with dolls, they're preparing themselves so that they understand what love is when they grow up into an adult. They have practiced, you might say. And so in all ways that we worship the great ones, that they're honorable, they're helpful, and they bring out those qualities, and they inform us. You could say they awaken within us our ability to love. And I think the avatars come that we might form a relationship with them. Oftentimes we approach God in very exalted ways. And I look back on, even in India, the development years and years ago when Shankara was alive in his day. He preached a philosophy of a very strict Vedanta Advaitic philosophy. And people have took that, and people, you could say, disparage the personal relationship with God. But they forget that Shankara himself, Adi Shankara himself, was a greatly devoted person, a devoted devotee of the Divine Mother. He himself worshipped in a personal way. And to just take an exalted philosophy of the Vedantic philosophy and cut out the personal element of it is not going to be satisfying to the deep element of the soul's craving for a personal relationship. There's no object to which we can give our love in that way, and our spiritual quest becomes dry. So it's helpful. And this is, you see, in the development after Shankara's time, the rise in India of centuries of great saints, Ramanuja, the Namdev, Tulsidas, ultimately Chaitanya, and all the great saints of devotion that came, said, chant the name of God, love God, don't worry about that philosophical side. Not to say we should dismiss it, but add to it. Put the love of, visualize God in whatever form that appears to you. God is infinite. So God, ultimately by implication, is in everything. A leaf in the flower, whatever it is that we offer, are but symbols of that love that we feel for God. And so to dismiss the personal aspect is not, I think, there are always exceptions, but for most people, it's not healthy. It's not spiritually healthy. So to realize that God is in everything, but again, going back to where I started, to say, it's more correct to say God is in these forms. The form is not God, but God, they contain, you could say, they're vehicles, they're vessels for God's expression. They symbolize, you might say, and they become vessels, pure vessels in the case of an avatar, pure instruments for the expression of divine consciousness. That, in this case of Janmashtami, the Krishna consciousness, that, or in the Western tradition, the Christ consciousness, that expression of the divine consciousness within every particle of creation. So remember, grace, we are not alone in this world. Grace comes to those who open their hearts. God cares for every one of us, and God comes often through the instrument of the avatar. He may have lived thousands of years ago, Krishna did, but for all masters, there's no such thing as a time barrier. They can be summoned right now by the loving devotee. So then, the message for us then is awaken that Krishna consciousness within ourselves. Look in, and he's represented, you could say, symbolically, yes, through stories. He's symbolically through murtis. We have on the altar, most of the Ananda altars, we have Krishna on the altar, through, artistic representations. But within each one of us, there's an element of Krishna, and that's the light at the spiritual eye, the light of that Krishna consciousness, that Kutashta consciousness here. The blue, the Krishna blue, is, as he's often envisioned, the blue that can be seen in that light. He's that doorway. Krishna is the living form, symbolic of that doorway within each one of us, through which we approach God. It's in the Christian tradition. It says, no one comes on to the Father except through the Son. That Son is the Krishna consciousness. So no one approaches the great Brahman except through the doorway of that Krishna consciousness here at the spiritual eye. And we can make this, each one of us, a living reality through our daily practices, through our worship, through the offering of our little self, the little ego, up into that light. And for those of us who practice Kriya, we can take that message into our daily practice, the self-offering of the little self into that light of Krishna. Oh, great soul Krishna, I offer myself into thy light. Receive me, guide me, be one. Let me be one with thee. Om Shanti Shanti.